Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Conservation Associate in the Conservation Department here at the museum. My name is Emma Rathie. I'm Manager of Programs and Exhibition Production here. If you're not familiar with our In Focus series, the program highlights projects going on around the museum that often happen behind the scenes. And in today's lecture, Emily will be discussing Marcia Resnick's Man in Mexico, a large gelatin silver photograph on photo linen with applied oil paint. This object was prepared at the George Eastman Museum for the exhibition, Marcia Resnick as It Is or Could Be. Works on photo linen are relatively rare, and preparing this particular work was a challenging project. This presentation will cover the steps that were taken by the conservators and preparators to treat, mount, frame, ship, and install this work for the exhibition. This exhibit closes on June 11th, so I invite you all to visit our main galleries before it's deinstalled. At the end of the talk, we're going to have some time for a Q&A. At that time, if you would please wait for me to get to you with the microphone, we would really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Thank you, Emma, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us on this very rainy day. Today, as Emma said, I'll be talking about preparing Marcia Resnick's Man in Mexico. Both the project and this presentation were a collaboration between myself, Tina Meller, who's sitting in the back there, our conservator in charge, and Sarah Casto, our former assistant conservator. The exhibition, Marcia Resnick as It Is or Could Be, was jointly organized by the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the George Eastman Museum, and is Resnick's first ever museum retrospective. In the 10 years between 1973 and 1982, Marcia Resnick created more than a dozen photographic series and photo books. Combining biting social critique with poignant, often humorous performance, her photographs engage aesthetic, social, and political issues at once timely and timeless. Born and raised in New York, Marcia Resnick graduated from Cooper Union and earned an MFA from the California Institute of Arts in 1972. She then resettled in New York City and became an active participant in the downtown cultural avant-garde. If you haven't already, I hope that you will all visit the main galleries to see this exhibition during your visit. One of the series on view is Revisions, which was conceived as a fictional memoir illustrating coming-of-age moments in a teenage girl's life. Resnick also created work for her own column in the Soho Weekly News titled Resnick's Believe It or Not. And in the exhibition, there's also this series titled Bad Boys. For this body of work, Resnick photographed different men and some women in New York, often artists, musicians, and other cultural figures associated with the downtown scene. You may notice as you walk through the galleries that while the majority of the prints in this exhibition are 16 by 20 inches or smaller, there is one print that is significantly larger than the others. This particular work arrived at the museum in a narrow tube. The diameter was less than 3 inches, where it had been stored very tightly rolled up for a prolonged period of time. The work, titled Man in Mexico, is an example of Resnick's early landscape work, which often explored the body and the body's relationship to space. In her earlier works and landscape series, she often altered photographs with paint, pencil, charcoal, or other drawing materials at a time when such intervening on photographic surfaces was often considered unacceptable. In this work, she printed the photograph on a material called photo linen and then applied paint to the surface. We carefully unrolled Man in Mexico shortly after its arrival in February 2021. After which it was thoroughly condition reported and subsequently photographed for the exhibition catalog. In our attempts to find more information on photo linen, we came across a master's thesis by Kaylee Vander Gulik from 2017 titled Shedding Light on Photo Linen, Defining Atypical Silver Gelatin Developing Out Material. According to Gulik, modern photo linen was commercially produced from the 1960s to the 1990s, and it was made using thin, plain weave cotton rather than linen. The fabric was first sized and then coated with the same type of silver halide emulsion that's used for gelatin silver developing out papers. When examining this work, we immediately noted several condition issues, including tear repairs with pressure-sensitive tape. Most of these tears appeared to be the result of handling and displaying the work by tacking it directly to the wall. This tear at the top left was repaired at some point in the past with a large piece of white tape on the back and 2 smaller pieces of clear tape on the front. Over time, the tape on the back caused discoloration that is visible on the front. Resnick had applied white paint over part of the stain and the tape. We chose not to remove this tape, as it would have significantly altered the appearance of the work. The central figure, ground, and palm trees were overpainted with oil paint to alter the image. The silver image showed localized warm oxidative reductive deterioration at the margins of many of the painted areas as a result of interaction with the oil paint. It seems likely that this image deterioration occurred early in the life of this print, as the paint gave off oxidative products while drying. Orange chemical stains at the bottom left resulted in discoloration and staining of both the textile support and the silver image. As with the tape stains, white paint was applied over the chemical stain in the white margins. The added paint made these areas less flexible than the rest of the print. Numerous creases and cracks from handling were noted throughout, especially at the corners and edges, but fortunately, the photographic binder remained physically stable, other than minor abrasions at some of the most severe creases. In addition to the condition issues, we also documented the 2 inscriptions on the verso of this work. While the work arrived in early 2021, preparing Man in Mexico for the current exhibition wouldn't start until early 2022. While it would have been ideal to leave the work unrolled and let it relax and flatten during that time, it was occupying far too much valuable bench space in the conservation lab, and it had to be rolled up. Naturally, we didn't even consider the narrow tube in which it had arrived, but instead purchased a large 7-foot by 1-foot heavy-duty tube, which I covered with Marvel seal barrier film and then carefully rolled the photograph around it. This time, we rolled it perpendicular to the direction of its curl, hoping that it would help to reduce the curl and make the future mounting and framing easier. We used several wide Tyvek straps to secure the rolled photograph. Because the tube was quite heavy, I added 1/2-inch foam to the ends to prevent any weight from pressing the artwork. And here it is in storage in the photo conservation lab for a whole year while we considered our plan for presenting the work in the exhibition. As we were brainstorming the potential ways to present this challenging work, we received from the artist both a description and this image from a previous exhibition using thumbtacks. We were interested in keeping this kind of casual aesthetic, but in a way that would be safer for the preservation of the object. There were a number of considerations that had to be factored into our plans. The photo linen support was perhaps the biggest consideration. This material is quite different from paper, but also differs from working with a canvas or an uncoated textile. While it was pretty flexible, it also was extremely curly, thin, and the edges had, as Tina put it, a potato chip texture that was a little disconcerting to handle at first, more like parchment almost than like fabric. The material, curl, distortion, and uneven edges would play into our planning process. The artist specified that if glazing the work, we would need to use anti-reflective glazing, which would be a significant expense that we had not factored into our earlier budget estimates. While the curators and the artists were open to considering other possibilities, everyone agreed that the preference would be to float the artwork, meaning that the entire edge of it would be visible. We also wanted to take into consideration that the work would need to be installed, deinstalled, and shipped multiple times over the run of the exhibition, and didn't want to take an approach to installing the work that would be difficult or risky for the staff members of the other institutions. Lastly, the height of the piece, almost 50 inches, limited our selection of materials to supports that came in sizes over 48 by 96, which is a cutoff point for many oversized materials. While we've had many contemporary oversized works mounted using pressure-sensitive acrylic adhesive onto dye bond or acrylic, such as these large works in Tanya Marcuse's exhibition Woven, because of the nature of the object's fragility and planar distortions, we very quickly ruled out any type of overall mounting. I'm obsessed with magnets, so another early thought was whether we could use magnets in some way. This work by the artist Lorna Bieber, titled Tapestry, is the largest two-dimensional work we've prepared at 11 feet by 27 feet. This work was hung entirely with magnets, using a bracket that incorporated steel plates. However, I was concerned that the magnets would be problematic for a traveling exhibition. We hoped to avoid damage from handling by shipping the work already framed. It had to be shipped vertically because of its size, and magnets which would be strong enough to guarantee that the work wouldn't shift in transit could potentially create indentations in the material, as well as being large enough to be visually distracting. Our next thought was to use pull-through or wraparound hinges with archival tie core as the mounting board, as we did for this work by Joshua Rashad McFadden from his Selfhood series. However, the 4 works in this series, as well as the previous projects we used this method for, were all under 48 inches in width, and I had difficulty finding a source for the same material in a large enough size in the US. We were also concerned that the photo linen was transparent enough that hinges applied to the back could be visible through the front of the photograph. While they are relatively rare, we do have a few examples of works on photo linen in the collection. This work by B. Nettles was stretched and framed by the artist, and during her exhibition we installed it in a wall case to protect the delicate surface. We considered stretching as an option, but ruled it out since there was no indicator that it had been stretched in this way in the past, and felt that it would alter the appearance too significantly. Also, the material was very brittle around the edges, and the shape of the print wasn't square. After considering these and other possibilities, in the end we decided to try using 4-ply mat board mounted to dye bond as the mounting board. This would have several advantages over other supports we considered. It would allow us to match the same warm white color of board used for framing the other works in the exhibition, while providing the benefit of the rigid quality of dye bond. Both materials have also passed AUDI testing, meaning that they were safe for the long-term preservation of the work. Lastly, and critically, they both came in sizes over the 48 by 96 inch cutoff of many other materials. It had the added benefit of being much thinner than a honeycomb panel, allowing us more space in the frame for the deep spacers we would need to accommodate the undulations in the object. We decided to test out stitching through this material to mount the work. Since there was a large number of existing holes, this would be relatively non-invasive, strong enough for travel, and would reproduce something of the original pin-to-the-wall aesthetic with fewer conservation concerns. Because the full-size sheet was going to be a considerable investment and it was a material that was entirely new to us, I ordered a sample from a framing company called Lamont in New York to test out what technique, materials, and tools we would use to stitch the work. Around 9 months after we first unrolled and examined the work, we unrolled Man in Mexico for the second time to finalize the mat board color. As you can see here on the right, the fabric support is very thin, translucent enough for the board to show through it. You can actually kind of see the corner sample for that board right here. And of course, before ordering the frame, we had to triple check our measurements. We also, at this time, performed multiple tape removals on the back of the object. The tapes were mostly Scotch-Tite pressure-sensitive tape and were still in good condition. We decided to remove these tapes since they were randomly applied and did not provide any structural support. Removing them before they deteriorate prevents them potentially staining the work in the future, especially where they could affect the image or obscure inscriptions like the artist's name and address in this corner. They were removed mechanically by carefully peeling the tape carrier back and most of the adhesive away. Any remaining adhesive residues and embedded dirt were removed with a vinyl eraser. At this point, we also vacuumed and manually removed as many fibers and particles from the back of the print as possible, knowing that when the work was in transit, these could easily fall from the surface and become visible in the frame. The frame, which was also fabricated by Lamont in New York, was delivered about a month later. This was my team at the time, Michael, David, and Granville, working to unpack the frame from the crate. We did reuse this crate for shipping, but with some modifications. The packing of the frame had a lot of wiggle room and not a lot of cushioning, and the inner packing materials made it impossible to unpack without turning the work face down, which we wanted to avoid. David and Michael opened, inspected, and cleaned the frame before we began mounting. Because the work wasn't square in any direction, and because of the planar distortions, positioning the work so that it would look evenly centered in the frame was a little bit of a challenge. After I was satisfied with the position, I marked the corners with removable tape. I worked with Tina and Sarah to determine the best holes for sewing along the top edge, and marked holes onto the mounting board with a pin. Our goal was to use as many of the existing holes as possible, adding new holes only where necessary to create a pair of points through which to sew. Some of the holes that we decided to use needed to be reinforced. We chose a thin, non-woven polyester fabric as our support material, and Biva 371 film as our adhesive, which is a heat-activated adhesive. After the heat-activated Biva film was attached to the polyester fabric, we cut it into small pieces, slightly larger than the sewing holes, and attached it to the back of the photograph using a heated Teflon-coated spatula. Here's a close-up of a reinforced hole, which you can probably just barely make out where that reinforcement happened. Biva doesn't remain tacky once it has cooled off, and very importantly, it didn't contribute to any visual deformations on the front. After we finished reinforcing the holes, I enlarged the pin marks on the mounting board with an awl. I ended up using a .036-inch drill bit that I'd purchased for pin mounting from a company called Benchmark to drill the holes. Here I'm checking the depth and marking it with tape on my bit. Next, I drilled all of the holes along the top edge. Initially, the holes were a little bit raised on the top and rough on the back, which wasn't ideal. So I burnished the raised bump on the mat board with a Teflon folder, which is this white tool right here. And on the back, the aluminum burrs were removed with a Dremel. I smoothed the interior of the holes by aggressively rubbing sturdy linen thread through and around the interior of the hole, and began sewing along the top edge using cotton thread and an antique white. I ran the thread through each pair of holes, and then Sarah and I tied them off. After testing different knots, we settled on using 2 half hitches to get the knot snug, and then a square knot to keep it from slipping. We used sewing weights on top to help keep the stitch from shifting while we were tying. In the corners, there were many existing holes to choose from, but along some stretches, the staple holes were too ragged and close to the edge to reuse, so we did have to make new holes for some of the stitches. On the right is an example of a thumbtack hole with a new hole just 3/16 of an inch to the left, so this was the new hole. We also added Tyvek tape to the back to reinforce the knots and secure the thread ends. After sewing the top, we raised the object into a vertical position on our A-frame to see how gravity would affect the object. The sewing on the top seemed sufficient for the weight of the artwork, and in this position, we could really assess how the curl and planar distortions would appear in the frame. We determined that the stitching on the sides and the bottom could be spaced further apart, since they would primarily be holding back the curl and not having to hold much weight. We used magnets in cushioned Tyvek pouches to hold the edges in place temporarily while deciding on the best position for the side and bottom stitches. We weren't attempting to eliminate the curl or distortion completely, but wanted to have them feel natural and to undulate in the same way that the previous pushpin display had. Once we were satisfied, I marked the position of the holes onto the mounting board with a pin. To be able to work on drilling these holes, we had to roll the piece all the way back to the top edge, which made it awkward to then move around on the table, which in turn made it awkward to reach one of the three sides. Once we had completed sewing the sides and bottom, it was ready to go into the frame. We used 1.5-inch spacers to give us the depth needed for the print to not come in contact with the glazing. Even with the undulations and curling edges, the interior was lined with aluminum-backed lining tape. When we checked the artwork for dust and cleaned the interior of the Optium glazing. It was very, very snug in the frame. I realized that the mat board layer had been trimmed ever so slightly larger than the dye bond, and I had to shave it down so that I could improve the fit. And then we placed the strainer into the frame before checking again for dust. After going through that routine a few times, because dust is our enemy, we were finally satisfied that we'd removed as much as we possibly could and screwed the strainer into the frame. One of my main concerns with our choice of mounting method was that the stitching would be too visible and distracting, but as soon as it was in the frame and we could step back a little, we agreed that the stitches were really very subtle. Since the piece was initially photographed with weights around the edges, we asked Liz Chang, the museum photographer, to image it again before packing it up. We packed the work into the crate, which I'd modified with closed-cell polyethylene foam to give the frame a better fit and to add more cushioning than the insulation foam alone. The work is now wrapped and crated so that it never needs to be turned face down to unpack it. We loaded it onto the truck, and it was off to the first venue. Here it is installed at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art in Maine on the left, and installed at the Minneapolis Institute of Art on the right. We installed it in our own galleries in January. Here, Mike, David, and I are hanging the work using a cleat. Cleats are a great way to install larger, heavier works of art because they are very secure and they distribute the weight of the frame along the wall. After the work is installed, we adjust the lighting to conservation recommended light levels. While gelatin silver photographs in good condition can be exhibited at up to 90 lux, depending on the duration of the exhibition, we used a slightly lower light level of 70 lux because of the deterioration and unusual combination of materials used to create this work. And I hope that if you haven't already, you'll swing by our galleries so that you can see it in person. I'd like to thank Marcia Resnick, as well as Deborah Bell Photographs and Paul M. Ertzman, Inc., for lending this work to us and for trusting us with its care and presentation. I'd like to thank the amazing crew of preparators who I worked with on this project at various stages: David, Michael Darcy, Granville, and Michael Philippek. Thanks as well to the curators who worked on the exhibition: Frank Goodyear, Lisa Hostetler, Casey Riley, and Jamie Allen. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join me today. Before I take any questions that you all might have, I wanted to direct you to a webinar that I gave earlier in the spring that's available through the FAIC's Connecting to Collections Care website. My talk today is very focused on a specific object, but this webinar has a lot of general information on the preservation of photographs while on display that could be useful not only to museums, but to your own personal photographs. So yeah, if there are any questions that we can't get to today, you might be able to find some answers there. Thank you. I think there's a question in the back.
Thanks. First of all, I wanted to say I had no idea that kind of effort went into exhibiting anything. So I appreciate that. It really, I don't know how many hours you put in. Do you have an idea of how many hours went into doing what you just described?
I would say that a lot of the time was not necessarily time that was physically working on it, but the time just like while you're eating dinner, before you go to bed, where you're thinking through the problem in your head. How am I going to solve this issue? Is this a possibility? Is that a possibility? I would say that the actual working time might have been around 3 or so days, 3 to 4 days. But that thinking time went much more.
I'll bet. I guess I don't really have a question. I'm pretty amazed at the whole thing. It really will help me appreciate things more as I'm walking through any place, I guess, from now on. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I've often said to people that the better we do our jobs, the less you notice that we've done anything at all. So it's actually a compliment when people don't see the work that we do, because I think that sometimes, you're noticing when things go wrong. If it's going right, then all of your focus is just on the artwork. And that's my hope for our visitors. Well, thank you so much.